So welcome, everybody. My name is Ilyana Kuziemko. I'm a professor in the economics department, along with Professor Steve Redding. I'm the co-director of the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies. And on behalf of the Griswold Center, along with the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, the Center for Health and Wellbeing, and the Research Program on Development Economics, I want to thank you for coming today to the book discussion of Economics in America, An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality by our dear colleague, Professor Sir Angus Deaton. I see so many familiar faces in the audience, and it's no surprise that we have such a great turnout because, in my view, Angus represents everything that is best about Princeton economics. He came to Princeton in 1983 and became a senior scholar and emeritus professor in 2016. In between his arrival and his retirement from active duty here in the department, he has accomplished so much that I'm going to give a very, very quick summary. Besides writing over 200 papers, editing Econometrica, and authoring 6 books. He, of course, received in 2015 the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he received it as the sole recipient, which is not typically the case. I like to say that Angus received the Nobel Prize for being Angus. There wasn't just one accomplishment. There were important contributions in consumption, poverty, welfare, health, and inequality. And he was made a Knight Bachelor in the British Commonwealth in 2016. So I'm going to hand it over to Angus. After Angus gives some remarks, he's going to be in conversation with Julian Zelizer, and I'll introduce Julian at that time. So Angus, take it away.
Thank you, Ilyana. Maybe I'll start by saying something about the tie. Which the original is the book cover, and this was Princeton Press's idea. And I was rather sad that I didn't have such a tie, and said that a couple of times, and then one appeared in my mailbox. And so I wear it for these occasions. I don't wear it very often, unfortunately. So let me tell you a little bit of what the book is about. It's partly a memoir of an immigrant, me. I came to the US in 1983. There are many stories in the book about economists, myself and other economists, and who are we, how we work, what we're like. Are we all neoliberal market fundamentalists or fascists, as some of our critics would call us? And this is partly because I don't think most people, ordinary people, have much idea of how economists go about their business. So part of the attempt book was to tell that. And through these stories, I'm sort of a little bit interested in telling the story of economics itself over the last 30 or 40 years that I've lived in the US. And there's some topics too, and I'll talk a little bit about those today. One of them is minimum wages, another is foreign aid and poverty in America and around the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about deaths of despair and the work that I've been doing with Anne. And today's mess and the role of economics and economists in it. So the one interesting question here is whether economists are to blame. I don't think anyone thinks we're the only people to blame, but we might share some of the blame. And, you know, a lot of people, especially I think young people, have lost faith in capitalism, or at least this is practice in the United States, as well as any faith or trust in economists who are sort of seen as the apologists for capitalism. Many, I don't think we all are, but some certainly are. Did economics take a long turn, and did we get some important things wrong? I think one of the most irritating things about economists and non-economists is just how arrogant we often are. And we sort of tell people that you don't understand. We're the only people who understand in a sort of priestly sort of way. And this is not a book that says Angus Deaton was right all along and everybody else was wrong all the time. You know, there are plenty of those sort of books out here. And, you know, I was an enthusiastic participant in most of the stuff that was going on. And I sort of changed my mind in important respects, I think. I mean, I haven't thrown away everything I've learned, but I do feel differently about a number of things. If you're interested in very contrasting views, there's a YouTube video of a discussion between me and Larry Summers, which is pretty unpleasant, but perhaps informative. It took me about a week to recover from doing that. And a much friendlier one done a week or so ago with Paul Krugman. Both of those are on YouTube. So one of the first things that happened fairly early on was Card and Kruger were working on minimum wages, and they wrote this subsequently very famous paper, which you can read about on the Nobel website if you haven't read about it before, that New Jersey increased its minimum in April 1992, but not Pennsylvania next door. They knew this would happen in advance and collected data on employment and fast food places in both states. And this is perhaps the first conscious example, at least, of what came to be known as design-based econometrics. I mean, you designed the whole study in a way that would help you get at the number you wanted to know. Now, economics textbooks at the time, and even now, would say that employment should fall in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania, but that's not what happened. If anything, the reverse, and it rose in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania, rather oddly because employment fell in Pennsylvania. It wasn't that it went up in New Jersey. And of course, this was a great challenge to conventional wisdom. Jason Furman has said that this study has persuaded about half the profession even today, 30 years later. The storms of criticism at the time were something as I, as a sort of relatively new immigrant, couldn't believe people would say things like this. And Buchanan, Nobel laureate in the Wall Street Journal, had said at least most of the profession has not become a bunch of camp-following whores, which seemed like a pretty strong statement. It's odd because this is perfectly consistent with standard economic theory. If employers have some monopsony power, they have power to hold down wages. But I mean, that's a very interesting thing because it changes the whole complexion of how you think about these things. Because instead of competitive markets, you've got a class struggle about the allocation of profits between labor and capital. And that's not the way that economists usually think about these things. It's not that we haven't thought about those. Pranab Bardhan in his new memoir says that he once asked Paul Samuelson at MIT what he'd learned from Marx. And Paul Samuelson wrote a lot about Marx. And he asked Paul, what did you learn from Marx that no one at MIT would learn? And Paul immediately said, class struggle. And I think class struggle is sort of coming back into economics in some sense. I wanted to give you this example, which I love, which comes from Orly Ashenfelter's podcast, that the increasing minimum wage is an example of pre-distribution, which Ilyana has been writing about too. It's not supported by free market economics. You're messing with the prices. It's not even supported by second-best economics, which tends to let the market go and then do income redistribution afterwards. And this is a story about Ray Marshall, who was Carter's Secretary of Labor, and a really interesting guy. He grew up in an orphanage in Mississippi, and by lying about his age, ran away and joined the Navy at some point. Eventually got a PhD in economics and became Carter's Secretary of Labor. He wanted to increase the minimum wage, and Blumenthal and Charlie Schultz, who were Treasury Secretary and Chairman of the Council, were opposed to that. They couldn't settle it, so they went to the Oval Office and talked to Jimmy Carter. And Ray Marshall, having listened to the other two, said, this is not an economic argument, this is a moral argument. There are about 5 million people out there who won't get a rise unless we give it to them. And they don't have a lot of power. You know who they are. They're not well educated. And Carter said, I'm sold. We're going to do it. And when they went into that little anteroom outside the Oval Office, Charlie Schultz says to Ray Marshall, that was dirty. And Ray said, no, Charlie, your problem is that you're monolingual. You can only speak economics. Now I'm bilingual. I can speak economics and Baptist. All right. And these arguments about ethics and power are not the common language of much of conventional economics as it's been practiced in policy over the last 30 or 40 years. So here's another area where I'm worry about what we've done. And, you know, we're taught from a very early age, almost as a part of your economics license, that trade is an engine of prosperity and that freer trade is in the national interest. We're also told, and I sort of bought into this for a long time, that large-scale poverty reduction around the world is an extraordinary achievement that is unparalleled in human history. Sorry, that's true. Between 90 and 2019, 1.4 billion people exited the World Bank destitution poverty line. And the argument was typically that if some people in rich countries were hurt, that was sort of okay, because they were much better off to start with than the poor people in India and China or Bangladesh or wherever this was happening. That seemed to me like a reasonable argument too. And they say, well, there are no comparably poor people in the United States, so, you know, lump it. We're making the world a better place. And the ethical basis of this is a sort of half-remembered utilitarianism, which says that poorer people should have priority. I think the better phrase for it is what I call cosmopolitan, or what philosophers call cosmopolitan prioritarianism, meaning you give priority to the worst off, but you do it on a worldwide basis, not just on a national basis. Now, Danny Roderick has been telling us for a very long time that once tariffs are pretty low, the gains and losses are first order, and the net gain is second order. It's triangles and rectangles in common language. We tell people that, you know, we should compensate them for the harm, but then we rarely, if ever, do. And the costs of moving today especially can be very high. And it's not just money. People say, well, you know, lots of jobs get lost all the time and people survive that, but you lose communities. And if you lose communities, much more serious things happen. The place matters. And marriages have been lost, and there's a lot of other bad stuff going on too. There's also the weakening of unions by trade, because it changes the elasticity and it makes it much easier for managers to stand up to unions. It's also true that there is truly awful poverty in America, and Kathy's sitting there. And, you know, Matt Desmond and others have documented this. Arguably as bad as in Africa, and especially if you don't use, money is just not the right thing to measure these things. It's again community and how people are doing, and the sort of despair that can come from community destruction. And the disputes here are not really about whether such awful poverty in America exists, though there are people who say there's no poverty in America at all, but about its extent and its quality. And so I'm not sure I believe that anymore either. None of which challenges the legitimacy of a concern for global poverty. The other thing is that cosmopolitanism, and there's genuine disagreement about this, it doesn't make as much sense to me now as it used to, either ethically or practically. I mean, ethically, we have legitimate, you may think of all national beauty, all national boundaries as being ethically and morally irrelevant, which some philosophers take the view. But these lines exist, and as a result of those lines, you have responsibility to your fellow citizens, whether you like them or not. So it's not a matter of liking them or feeling much sympathy with them. You know, you have to go to war on their behalf. You have to pay taxes on their behalf. You have to submit to the legal system. So you're locked in a contractual arrangement with these people, whether or not you like it. And that gives you a set of ethical duties to those people. You may not think very much, but some. And you know, we, the deciders who've been deciding economic policy, are part of an educated elite that pays very little price and may actually benefit from trade and globalization. There are a lot of us here who are immigrants. I'm looking around the room. And you know, we've done pretty well out of this, but a lot of other people have not. There are also practical issues, which the guys in Bangladesh who benefited from the trade don't get to vote in American elections, right? If they got to vote in American elections, the calculus would be very different. But the people who do get to vote in American elections legitimately get to vote, and if they don't like what's going on, if they don't like the involuntary foreign aid that's being given on their behalf, or their jobs being given away, they're going to come after us with pitchforks. And, whatever you think of that, you may think they're a bunch of benighted racists or whatever, but they get to vote and they get to legitimately vote, and it's stacking up enormous trouble for us. There's also a final but as to whether the price we paid in America was actually necessary. 75% of the 1.4 billion reduction are China and India. China exports played very little part in the real poverty reduction in India. I mean, it's not an export powerhouse. China saves more than half of its GDP. And so you can imagine a world in which China was not consuming so much of its GDP and consuming more of what it produced, and you could recreate the Chinese growth miracle without so much trade. That might make us worse off by the usual economic calculus, but we wouldn't be in the pickle that we're in now. So I'm going to just say a few words about the work that Anne and I have been doing. Our findings, according to us, point to failures in American society and to failings in policy, including economic policy. In the book, I spend quite a lot of time discussing what economists' reactions have been to those, including those who say, well, no one forced them to put needles in their arms, that sort of thing, and we shouldn't interfere with choice. So this picture, which may be familiar to a lot of you, just shows life expectancy at birth in the US and in 22 other rich countries. So, in 1980, the US was in the middle of the pack, but it ain't in the middle of the pack anymore. I just updated this yesterday, and you can see that it's bounced back a little bit, but we're so of the other countries. This is actually 25 other countries now. And these are as widely dispersed as Korea and Hong Kong and Canada and all the rich European countries, not the Eastern European countries. We look more like Russia or Poland. In fact, Poland now has higher life expectancy than the US. I just wanted to show you this. This is Scotland, where I come from. And you can see Scotland's always been pretty lousy on health. This is the point where people start thinking about deep-fried Mars bars and things. It was tracking with the pack, albeit at a lower level, until what's happened now. And Scotland has drug deaths that are about the same proportion of the population as the US does. So it's just one counterexample, at least, to the fact that, the US is not unique in this. And this, of course, is the punchline, which is if you take life expectancy at 25, you can't do it at birth because you don't know whether they're going to college or not. But you take life expectancy 25, then that's what it looks like for Americans with a four-year college degree. And then the 62% of the currently adult population that does not have a four-year college degree, their life expectancy at 25 looks like the bottom line. And you can see that since 2010, it turned around, and the guys with the BA are doing fine, but the rest of the population really is not, and they got hit much harder, COVID. That gap, which was about 2 years at the beginning, is about 8.5 years at the end. So there's something really bad happening to people without a four-year college degree. This is putting the Europeans back in. And you can see that college-educated Americans look like Japan or Switzerland. And, uncollege-educated Americans don't look like that at all. So just a few words and then I'll stop. What does this have to do with economic policy? Well, trade. And it's not just trade, it's automation and all the other things that are destroying communities. But the harm is mostly to workers who do not have a BA. There's also this, what I would think of as the triumph of oligarchy in modern America, echoes of the Gilded Age. The consumer price standard in antitrust privileges consumers over producers. Sometimes that's okay, but it's this thing which I think economists are largely responsible for, us equating welfare with consumption. And that is not right. And it's a terrible thing to do. There's been a terrible, there's only about 6% of workers in the private sector are now in unions. And it's no accident. They've been persecuted out of existence. And that's a huge concomitant decline in political power. for unions in Washington. The unions all put together spend less than alphabet on lobbying in Washington. And, you know, Galbraith used to write about countervailing power, and he was worried about large corporations and thought that unions were the balance, but it's not true anymore. A lot of it is family formation. This is stuff that sociologists have done a better job than economists have through exorbitantly expensive healthcare system, much of it which is financed through a flat tax in workers. There's a huge decline in marriage, especially for people without a BA. Out-of-wedlock childbearing has continued to increase, what Kathy calls deinstitutionalization. I mean, people are just not connected up to anything. The changing social standards about sex outside marriage and the contraceptive pill, which have been so productive for college-educated or college-bound women, as Claudia Golden has written, have been catastrophic for working-class women because they deprived them of their negotiating power and their chance to get. And Anne and I have documented large increases in pain and loneliness and morbidity as well as in mortality. So to us, this is the threat of inequality to democracy. It's not just of income or even of wealth. It's just this widening gap in leading successful lives between a well-educated minority, which is running the country, and everybody else. And this focusing on global universal values, which are important, but neglecting local values, so that democracy is not working for the majority. And I think that could bring us all down. Just a few words about this global educated elite, what you might call the Davos set, I suppose, much of which is very successful, and much of it very wealthy, and it's composed of subsets of domestic elites. And this extends around the world. I mean, it's London, which is a very successful city in a very unsuccessful country. East and west coast of the US, British public schools and American universities, which are catering to a large number of non-citizens of the country. And, you know, a lot of us benefit from that. We love it. But, you know, American universities are not really American universities anymore in the sense in which they once were. And this excludes most of the rest of the domestic population. So we need to share more power and refocus towards domestic away from global, or we will have it done to us, which is going to be a very unpleasant situation. I have a last line about these alternative views of what economics is about. Some of us, this was something I really got from Amartya Sen, that he thinks one of the places we really went wrong was to adopt Robbins' definition of economics as about efficiency, about the allocation of scarce resources. Hayek, I love this quote from Hayek, "No one can be a great economist who is only an economist. He's likely to become a nuisance, if not a positive danger." That's Hayek, you know. He's sort of not the person you would normally think of as saying these things. And anyway, a very interesting guy, Hayek, in lots of ways. And then this wonderful quote from Pigou, which actually Hayek quoted in his inaugural lecture at the LSE in 1930s. It is not wonder, but rather the social enthusiasm which revolts from the sordidness of mean streets and joylessness of withered lives that is the beginning of economic sciences, or it ought to be. And then this wonderful quote of Keynes, which is not used as much as I think it ought to be. The political problem of mankind is how to combine three things: economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And I think we've been better at picking two of those and not being very good at getting all three. Okay, thank you very much.
Let me briefly introduce Professor Julian Zelizer, the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Julian is also a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He's a pioneer in the revival of American political history and has written 25 books, many of which are award-winning. And his current book that he's working on is on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the 1964 conventions.
Thank you. Congratulations on the book. It's wonderful to be part of this. It was wonderful to read it. I guess my first question is, what was it like, and why did you decide to write a book that wove your own personal life and perspectives into a book about your discipline?
Pressure from my publishers. They wanted another book. A lot of these pieces I'd written over the years, and then I tried to stitch them together, and that turned out not to work. So in the end, I converted them into what you see. But you see some of it still. There's a lot of occasional pieces. But I thought this was fun, and you know, stapling these things together did tell a sort of semi-unified story. I think my sense is most people either really, really like it or they really, really hate it. So I'm glad you're in the former category.
And can you tell us, for those who don't know your work as much or just know the work on paper, who were some of your intellectual influences as you became an economist?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, probably the greatest intellectual influence on me was Richard Stone, who won the Nobel Prize in 1983. And is not very well known in the United States. And the work he did it with, he worked with James Meade for Keynes at the very beginning of the war in building a system of national income accounts with proper double entry bookkeeping standards and so on, when Keynes was trying to figure out how to pay for the war. And he was a data guy, I think, from when he was born, and I wanted to be like him. The other one I'd known from almost as long as Amartya Sen. And Amartya has always been a sort of sheet anchor of humanism in a profession that's not always that way. I've also become a little conscious, as I'm writing recently, that, you know, when I grew up in Cambridge, England, it wasn't like American academia at all. There's a famous paper by George Stigler which says, why are economists all right-wing, right? And he argues in that paper that if you study economics properly, you'll naturally become a conservative, right? When I saw that title, I thought it was a typo, right? It's a paper in the Journal of Political Economy. I had never met a right-wing economist. The furthest right people in Cambridge in the 60s were Fabian socialists. You know, you couldn't get further right than that. But I did grow up in a very, very different environment to what you would see. And that environment is probably not there anymore to anything like the same. So.
And you had a quote that caught my eye in the book. You wrote that the decisions that go into construction of statistics are often political too, even at levels that might seem to be entirely technical. Recognizing this is not to cast doubt on statistics, but a prerequisite for understanding them. Beyond that, the democratic debate around the numbers of the state is both necessary and proper. If no one pays attention or questions a statistic, it is likely to be neither important nor even necessary. So for non-economists in the room, can you kind of explain or walk us through what you mean by that?
Well, I think there's this rather false belief that numbers are facts and politics are politics. And I doubt you believe that, right? So that I'm glad that passage struck your eye, because I presume you sort of agree with it. I mean, you could tell me why you agree with it.
Well, because of what you said. I mean, if you're a historian, and this was my next question, so I will connect them. There is a critique of economics that over time, the numbers overwhelmed the rest of the analysis, and a lot of the people you actually cited, Galbraith, and you can go to John Commons, and this other more institutionalist tradition faded, and that as a result, sometimes the political analysis was harmed because the numbers overwhelmed everything. So that just kind of resonated with a lot of what I have read, and I was curious, though, as a great economist, what you meant by it.
Well, it's also that I spent a lot of my time, for instance, constructing consumer price indices, which is about as technical as you can get. Yeah. And, you know, there's a lot of economic theory underlying that. There's an enormous amount of statecraft involved. I mean, one of the major tasks I did until quite recently was I was a chairman of the International Comparison Project Technical Committee, which was constructing the purchasing power parity exchange rates, which people use all the time to compare across countries or to run growth regressions or whatever they do with them. And you very quickly realize there's gross politics. Like dealing with the Chinese was incredibly difficult through all of this process because they would distort the numbers all the time for political purposes. That's a story that's not been well told, and I don't tell in the book, but I still don't understand why the Chinese are so keen to have the world believe that they're smaller than the United States. And they're not. There's no sensible set of national accounts in which China has not been bigger than the United States for the last decade. And yet every major newspaper says this world's second largest economy. It's the world's largest economy. So that was gross politics, but it's just that, you know, if you think how the consumer price index is made, you know, it's sort of bewildering and mind-numbing detail of how this stuff is collected. But even if you get down to the really nitty-gritty thing and there's someone out there in shops trying to choose what comes, that has political implications all the time. And so the more you try to say, why is this going wrong? How does politics creep into it? You realize it's baked into it from the first time you decide to collect some number and not some other number. And so you shouldn't be fighting that or denying it. It's just coping with it.
And how do we cope with it? So for the non-economist in the world of politics and policy, if you don't know the underlying assumptions and methods, how do you evaluate it?
Well, I mean, I think you have to challenge and you have to do the work. I think there's been a lot of, for instance, GDP is something that correctly gets much challenged. But a lot of the challenges have been just so far off base that, and I think the most effective challenges came from people like Tony Atkinson, you know, who understood, like almost no one else, where these numbers actually came from, and, you know, could see into, so even within the framework of GDP, you can see there's a lot of stuff that could be changed and could be done differently. And then, of course, there's this something that I've been writing about more recently, and is the equation of the national interest with GDP. I mean, that's a pretty weird thing when you think about it. And economists just do it as sort of second nature somehow. You say, you know, this increases GDP, so it's in the national interest. Well, there may be some special interests who are unhappy about it, but the very term special interest devalues them, you know, whereas there are other voters in the United States who feel very strongly about these things.
And then at the heart of this book is also a critique of the questions that economists have asked. And it's a very powerful account of how inequality and the kinds of issues that you and Anne wrote so beautifully about have not been really addressed sufficiently and not addressed at all in some cases by the profession. Why do you think that happened? Why did the economics profession veer away from issues that, if you read the press or you're in the world of politics, are kind of front and center?
Well, I think that is a really good question. And there's a wonderful book, a Princeton book by Elizabeth Berman called Thinking Like an Economist, which actually does the historical excavation and produces the documents to show how this obsession with efficiency took over economics. And it actually came from the left more than it came from the right, which is a very interesting perspective on the last 30 or 40 years of policymaking, because this push was not coming from where you might think it was coming, which is sort of neoclassical or neoliberal or libertarian economics. It was coming from the left. It was coming from Harvard and Rand, not from, not from right-wing ideologues. But I don't know, and I thought about this a lot, because you don't have to go back very far before things were different. I mean, you know, Milton, I had that quote of Hayek, that lovely quote of Hayek. Hayek was a philosopher, maybe more than he was an economist, even though he wrote incredibly important things in economics. Milton Friedman, you know, whether you like it or don't like it, and I don't much like it, was a real libertarian. And, you know, that's a systematic literature and philosophy which most of which I don't agree with, though there are echoes which most of us probably would agree with. And he believed in that, and he saw his economics as sort of subservient to that. And then, Keynes, and then you go back to Marx and Adam Smith and Ricardo. And I think it's just something that's happened in the last 40 years. And I think it's quite unfortunate. And we've become more technical, which in some ways is a good thing. We know how to count. We know how to differentiate. There are things like that. And those tools have been very, very important. But the things that used to be taught in economics departments, you would have a hard time finding any economic history, any sociology. And this idea that this individualism, which I guess comes from libertarianism originally, or liberalism or something, it goes back to David Hume, and perhaps was even unfortunate then, I think has been a sort of curse of economics. It's all individuals. We don't have families, we don't have communities, we don't live in places. And I mean, I'm exaggerating. And of course, there's economists who do almost everything you can think of, but I'm thinking of the sort of mainstream that's fed into policy.
So it's not baked into the profession that those kinds of questions wouldn't be asked, because there's a history of asking these big questions. And we're in a place now where maybe the technique or the methodology overwhelms the questions, or has taken priority over the questions. Is it possible for economics, in your mind, to reimagine itself and to keep the kinds of tools you like, but to bring it back to the big issues that those other economists used to write about?
I don't see why not. There's one very good thing about economics compared with many other professions, is we're a really young profession. And people at the age of 25 can get full tenured jobs at Princeton and Harvard and so on. And they're always looking for new things to do. And the world is coming. There's this phrase about being sandbagged by reality. I think the financial crisis and what's happened after that is really changed minds in fundamental ways. And I think it'll change the profession. It's harder to get economists to read philosophy, for instance, or to talk to philosophers. And again, when I was in Cambridge, when I was a kid, we sat around and talked to philosophers all the time. It was just the way people did economics. And I was sort of surprised that that didn't happen elsewhere. Everybody in the economics department was really excited about Rawls' principle of justice, the theory of justice. I'm not sure they'd even notice it anymore, would they? I don't know.
Do other disciplines enter into the conversation in economics departments, like sociology or history, or has it become relatively isolated from those?
I haven't taught in an economics department for more than 10 years, so I
Yeah.
be a bit careful about this.
You can speculate. No.
Especially if I'm saying it can change very fast.
Yeah.
But I think it's surprising that there's a very, very good ethics in economics textbook by Dan Hausman and Deborah Satz, which no one in any economics department has ever heard of.
Yeah.
And it's terrific. It's really good. And, it takes a whole bunch of issues that economists have talked about and examines them from different ethical perspectives and sees, from a philosophically literate perspective. In fact, the running theme through the whole thing is this famous letter that Larry Summers wrote in the World Bank, saying it was a good idea to dump pollution in poor countries because they weren't going to live very long anyway. And, it does us a lot more harm. He didn't write it, but he signed it. And they don't go after him. It's not a book that says, here's the worst of economics. It's just, how would you analyze this issue from a utilitarian, from a deontological, from other perspectives as to how you might do it.
And what's one for, again, a lot of people in the room are economists, some I see, but for those who are not, and in general, you wrote a book that's for a broader audience, what's one of the biggest misunderstandings of economics as a discipline that you've encountered over the years speaking with groups?
I think it's maybe the other way around. Economists tend to dismiss criticism of economics rather than, whereas they might think about it a little harder. And we do have this tendency for, sister subjects to think that, we know math, you don't know math, so shut up, I didn't understand it. I didn't know, Alan might know this, that the economics department was joint with Soch. Yeah, within living memory. So Richard Quant said, what?
Not too many people.
Well, you're older than I am by like 2 days, right? But you don't remember this. It wasn't true when you were an undergraduate here? No, okay. But when Richard...
Will Bauman was a member of the Department of Economics and Sociology.
Right, or it was called Economics and Social Structure or something of that sort. But Quant said that when he first came, that was and then it sort of split. So that's been another problem in some sense, that these disciplines are all moving into their own silos in a way that, in earlier times really was not the case. And the department at Cambridge was called the Department of Political Economy. And Richard Stone's told the story of being denied an American visa as a visitor to Johns Hopkins because he worked in the Department of Political Economy.
There's a great book by intellectual historian Dorothy Ross. It was called The Origins of the Social Sciences, and it's really progressive era. But it talks about some of this and the separation of economics from other disciplines where it was much more kind of woven and intertwined into these other questions and other approaches, and gradually it separates. So I would recommend that to anyone. And just to connect, so you also have this great chapter on the profession and what for some is a little mysterious, the conferences, the journals, how the profession works as a profession. How does all of that connect, the apparatus of economics as a profession, not just a discipline, to some of the problems or limitations that you're arguing exist?
Well, what disciplines do is they provide a safe haven for people. So if you're working on some totally esoteric thing that no one's really interested in, you can go to some place where no one will ask the basic questions. Like, how can you defend this? It's just a heap of nothing, right? And you go on forever working on it because there are interesting problems in there, and you can find other people who will attend conferences and talk to you about them and so on. So I think it's important. And also the journals are enforcing all sorts of professional constraints. They give prizes, they say who's good and who's not good, who's in the mainstream, who's not in the mainstream. And I think those are important mechanisms.
Did your work with Anne, given it was so out there, it was so public, it broke beyond the traditional disciplinary boundaries or walls of academia, did that affect you intellectually? Because you got a lot of response.
Absolutely. I mean, when we found these things and thought that they didn't fit in with the way I'd thought about economics before, it was the way we thought about economics that had to change. And then, the years I've spent talking to Amartya Sen were incredibly helpful, because he's always argued, and he's even argued that mortality is a better measure of social success than pretty much anything else. But it's still true. I mean, the other day I was asked, what are a couple of economists doing working on this? And that still seemed to me a little bit odd.
What did you say?
I don't know. I tried to be kind and patient. But, if people are not alive, the other stuff doesn't count for really very much. And also, I don't know. I've now rearranged my head so much that it's very hard to get back to the way maybe I thought before. Except I've always done some of this. Richard Stone worked on demography towards the end of his career too. So, and life and death matters always seem to be matters of life and death, at least to me. But the thing that I think is the big giveaway, and not everybody buys this, but it's been very important to us, to Anne and me, is this rising suicide rate. in the United States. And we're now overtaking places like Poland and Lithuania, which used to be the sort of suicide capitals of the world. There's something really gone wrong when large numbers of people are taking their own lives, and in a very explicit way. And also that, ever since Durkheim, people have believed that suicide was more common among more educated people. And many of us can relate to that because many of us left families and social structures behind when we got educated and we lost our roots. And that was the sort of Durkheimian argument. And so these data now, this is like, there's not much literature on this because the data's not very well collected, but it's now, the whole increase in suicide is among people without a college degree. So it's just, and that's calling out for some sort of story.
You worry. I mean, one of the things you write about pretty early in the book is anti-intellectualism, and you present it as somewhat cyclical. We have waves of anti-intellectualism, and then it gets better. Are you still confident that it's cyclical as opposed to structural?
Yeah. Sometimes you come off the roller coaster, right? You never get back to the other side. I mean, that's the problem with cycles. If they get out of control, then you don't bounce back again. I would be worried. Are you not worried?
I worry. No, I'm not as convinced it's cyclical.
Well, that was just paraphrasing Hofstadter,
Yeah.
who made that argument.
He was right. Yeah.
And he argued it was working through religion, which is not as powerful anymore as part of that story. That it was waves of religion. Though religion's pretty tied up in what's happening now.
Yeah.
Too.
And a few more questions, and I'm going to open it up to everyone. Well, let me ask, why did you decide to start the book with the McDonald's story, which is very captivating? You can tell people what it is if they haven't read it yet.
And tried very hard to make me take that out.
So why'd you keep it in?
Well, it's funny.
Started to speak.
It's funny. I think it's pretty funny. This is the story, if you haven't read the book, Anne's burying her head in her lap. She doesn't want to hear this story. This actually, I drive past this McDonald's every day, and it was, when I first came to America, McDonald's was health food. And by the comparison with the sort of things we had in Britain as hamburgers, it was health food. It was actually made of beef as opposed to sawdust and other things. And I was really worried about there being gangsters in New Jersey, so we were wandering around all the time expecting to be shot. And this was not The Sopranos. This was long, long before The Sopranos. But we British people believed that Al Capone was lurking around every corner. And I was carrying my tray in McDonald's loaded up with all the things all the health food we were going to eat. And there was this sharp report as of a gun firing. And I looked around the room and there was a guy with blood oozing out of his fingers. And it turned out I stood on a packet of tomato sauce and farted into his face. So, there were no gangsters in New Jersey. They'd all moved to Washington, D.C. That's sort of the story.
And the story, why did you put that in there in the end?
Well, I was talking about what it was like to come to America, and it was, the flip side of trying to figure out what's the difference between a pediatrician and a podiatrist, which I got very confused about when I first came to. And, encountering this healthcare system they're not such funny stories.
Where do you do your work?
When
you write, how do you do it? Do you sit at a desk? Do you, what's it like to be?
Oh, it's the most pleasurable thing. One of the most pleasurable things I do. There are a few others.
Where do you do it? I interviewed Robert Caro, the writer, earlier this year, and he talked about the actual writing process. Curious with your research, how you do it.
I do it anywhere I get a chance. I've written chapters in airports waiting for a plane, or, I don't have to have, some setting where it works perfectly and where it's quiet. The study I work in, for some reason, is very cold when I go in there. And then I begin to feel sick, and Anne will come rushing in and saying, it's 95 degrees in here. Will you please go somewhere else? So I try not to write there all the time.
And last question. I do like that bow tie. Very nice. It's on the screen here. I mean, you've had an amazing career as an economist. You've influenced the discipline. You've influenced our public debate. There's not many people like you. I mean, it's wonderful to read your book, to know about your career. If there is a young potential economist here, undergraduate thinking, I want to get into this discipline, what would be a piece of advice based on what you've written in this book about how they should think of what they want to do in this career and how to do it?
Oh, I'm not sure I'm really competent to do that, because I didn't do that. I just wandered around. But I did indulge my curiosity, and to the extent of perhaps not sticking with any topic for very long. And I always thought that would be a reason why I would never get the Nobel Prize, because, you know, I've just done a lot of different things, and I get bored quickly. And so when they called me up in the famous phone call, I sort of said, well, why are you doing this? And they told me a story of my research career, which I would never have thought of myself. So that tells you mostly the Nobels can make anything up they want to make up. Right? You don't want to take them too seriously. As Paul Krugman likes to say, they're just a bunch of Swedes.
Okay, well, we have time for some questions. You want to start? Oh, there's a mic.
Angus, you had mentioned thinking about economics more in terms of class war. And if you take the worker side of class war in the US, you're accused by people like Larry Summers and your debate with him of ignoring, much poorer workers. And there's this inherent trade-off, as Larry sees it, between the workers here and much poorer workers abroad. And yet, when I think of certain topics, such as, interest rates, the moment inflation here becomes uncomfortable, that those same people are very quick to say we need higher interest rates, even though that's devastating for low-income countries. If I think about intellectual property, again, that's something, loosening that would help poor countries, and yet we don't do that. Is there, besides those two topics, like a robust set of policies that would sort of allow the workers of the world to unite, so to speak, that would be, if anything, the group that sacrifices is the richest of the rich, not the workers in rich countries, but that would also benefit, the poor people that, that the U.S. class warriors are accused of ignoring?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And it's also been a criticism of Anna and my work that, this is, on the other hand, it's not the poorest of the poor who are going to come and wreck the country, right? So the practical argument, I think, remains there. No, I understand, yeah. I don't know the answer to that. And I was doing a podcast last night, actually, and at the end, this person said to me, you're for tariffs, you're against immigration, you don't like foreign aid. How are we going to help the poor people of the world, right? And I said, well, I don't adopt any of these positions. I just think we have to think about them with a more open mind, right? And so we'd have to it does make the world a much harder place, though, because you don't have ready-made recipes. It's pretty easy if you're just choosing on efficiency grounds and saying, well, I'm an economist, the politicians will handle the distributional issue, which has been a standard argument sort of idea. And we can't punt that. So we've got to think those through. And I mean, I think there are issues which are complicated and have those dimensions. Like, for instance, I'm endlessly hearing about forgiving student debt. Right? There's no simple answer to that because there's a lot of different moving parts to it. And there's no simple principle which is going to say, just let the market do this.
Angus, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation of the book, and you just covered so much ground. But just related to your answer a moment ago there, one of the things that's so striking that you pointed to is the big disconnect between, say, the growth in real GDP per capita versus the sort of trend in the real wage and the median worker, and this dramatic rise in inequality and in mortality that you highlighted. And a lot of us believe there are these large gains from improvements in technology and trade at the aggregate level, but it's not filtering down towards the bottom of the distribution. And so I guess two related points there are, firstly, as you highlighted, redistribution could occur, but it hasn't. And then secondly, even if it did occur, that many people care about pre-distribution rather than redistribution. And so I wondered why you think there is that strong belief in pre-distribution. So for example, I'm a still worker, I get a lot of value from actually being a still worker, doing my job, and if the government sent me a paycheck, I wouldn't feel the same. So why do you think there is that strong sense of pre-distribution? And if there is, what do you think is the right mix of policies, and how should we trade off aggregate efficiency versus tariffs, minimum wages, and so on, which, as you kind of highlighted a moment ago, there is a trade-off there, and how to think about the right weights there. I'd just be curious for any more thoughts.
I don't have the answer to that, and I'm 78 years old, and younger people are going to have to do this, some of which are in this room. But the second best was a sort of reaction like that, 30 or 40 years ago, right? And they said, well, the first best leaves all these sort of things hanging. We've got to do something about the redistribution. So here is how we can do it. And the Murley's tax stuff and the Diamond Murley stuff and all that sort of stuff. And it's turned out that's not enough somehow. And it's not that it's irrelevant. We wouldn't want to give up our redistributional system, and we wouldn't want to give up our welfare systems and things that we need. And I think part of the story of what's Anna and I write about is that welfare systems in Europe are much better than they are here, largely because they've been open to trade for much longer, and have had to deal with that, whereas the US can pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist and you don't need these systems. But the more detailed thing is, how do you go from second best to third best? And I don't know the answers to that, and I haven't. I mean, I'm a recent convert to my own preaching sort of idea, so I don't have the, I haven't done the work, and I doubt that I'm going to do it.
So I'm sorry. No, you should go first.
No, I was going to change the subject.
Let me just follow. What stirred this conversion? What happened?
No, just what happened was I got sandbagged by reality, or I got sandbagged by Ann Case, which would be another way of putting it. I mean, it's just very hard when you look at these people dying and these suicide rates that are going on, not to think that economics and the way economics has been practiced may not have something to do with that. I think the financial crisis too, which I haven't emphasized as much because everybody emphasizes that. But I mean, that was sort of, if there was any last belief that trickle down worked, that should have killed it for good. And so we really have to think about other ways. And the redistribution, I don't think ever happens. And there are very good political economy reasons why it doesn't happen. It's just very hard. And the workers don't want it either. The unions refer to it as burial insurance. That's not exactly something they're looking for.
So one of the things in economics that changed was that women came into the discipline. We weren't really welcome, but we came. And we actually changed the subjects that got discussed and researched as well. Suddenly, there was a much bigger interest in sort of the soft part of it, labor and family issues and development. And that's something that I think isn't really discussed in the book much.
I had no one to,
of women.
I had no one to talk to about that. Actually, it's interesting too, because one of the exceptional fields that has a lot of women and is very technical is demography. And that's always been strong there. But I think I agree with what you say, and I'm sorry that I didn't put more of it in. Oh, actually, there is some stuff about women in there, and about, I reported on this stuff about, women being maltreated in seminars and so on.
Thank you. I want to come back to a point you made about the threat of inequality to democracy. I've seen the pitchforks and the populism in Europe as well. But yes, based on your charts, the inequality there, at least in terms of life expectancy, is definitely not as bad. And even on other dimensions, I think the inequality has not risen as much. So how do you think about that? And how sure are you that the inequality is really the source of the the decay in the quality of democracy in the U.S.?
I'm not sure at all, but I'm trying to develop that argument. Several puzzles. One is, it's been a puzzle for Anne and I all along about why you don't see deaths of despair in Europe. And we have a whole bunch of reasons for why that might be the case. One of which is the extraordinary cost of healthcare, much of which is funded through a flat tax, and it's destroying jobs. And also they regulate pharma companies in Europe, so they're not allowed to addict people for profit and kill people to make enormous sums of money. And the trade issue, I think, which Danny Roderick again pointed out a long time ago, that small European countries have had to deal with this a lot longer. But this argument about, I was sort of joking about Davos, but not entirely. And I do think, London is a real example of a place that, here's this thriving city where people are getting incredibly rich, and it's doing very well. And the rest of the country has had no real wage growth since the financial crisis. And productivity growth has sort of stopped. So you've got this catastrophic thing in this city, which, as someone very unkindly put it, it's sort of tied to a dying corpse sort of idea, as if it was the corpse's fault. But, if you're part of that dying corpse and you see this incredibly successful city, which is full of crooks and not just crooks, but it's full of financiers, it's full of bankers, and it's full of Russian oligarchs, and that has become a huge scandal in itself. And when you see the British public schools, which are this huge engine of inequality in Britain, something like 40% of them before the pandemic were foreign students, mostly Chinese, but not exclusively so. I'm a part in America of, immigrants coming in and taking over the economics profession or becoming a big part of it. The Clark Medal came out yesterday, which went to a German economist who's at Yale. And if you look down the list of Clark medalists, the vast majority of them, even since the very beginning, were born outside the United States. Now, you can celebrate this, and most of us have celebrated it, this globalization, this global intellectual elite and global educated elite. But it's not so celebratory if you're one of the people left behind. And that's true in France too, right? The people out there, who are farmers or whoever, all the rest of it, are just not benefiting from this either. And you got Brexit in Britain. I think one of the reasons Scotland's doing so badly is because it has, had Brexit imposed on it by a bunch of politicians, none of whom they would ever have voted for. So it's become sort of a colony again in some sense. So I think this democratic deficit and this sense that everything's being run for this the elite, if you can, I hate calling it that, but what else can you do? But that seems really very important. And in India, a lot of it was too. You've got this enormously wealthy elite that's sending their kids to Harvard and Princeton and so on. And, the Hindu cow belt is just not getting any part of that at all. And Modi came and gave it to them. So the inequality I'm talking about is not income inequality. And I think economists have gotten hung up on that for too long. And wealth inequality is closer to it, but it's this power inequality or this sense of, democracy just not functioning for most people. Is that persuasive? A little bit, okay. Zach.
Thanks, Angus, for this talk and for the book. I wanted to come back to this earlier question about what I'm going to term your anti-neoliberal conversion. And so in part, it seems to me very striking that this conversion happened after you retired. So that after you've left the the combination of the rigmarole of academic life and all of the professional activities that we were discussing earlier. And I wonder if you have ideas for the profession of how those activities could be restructured, of how the profession could learn something from what is learned by people who exit it.
Well, that's one recommendation I could make. Everyone should get a Nobel Prize and retire. That helps a lot. I hadn't thought of that, but it seems to me to actually make some sense because I'm off the treadmill, and I'm not part of that. But part of it is I was incredibly fortunate in that when I got the Nobel Prize, there was no mention at all of any work on health. And now when people introduce me, they say, I want to introduce Angus Deaton, who was made famous by his work with Anne Case on Death and Despair, right? And I think of that as just a great gift, that at the end of my life, or the end of my working life, we made this discovery that turned into a whole second career. And I think that's been as important too. And just discovering that the tools that the way that economists usually thought about it, just wasn't really capable of dealing with this horror that we discovered. I mean, this sort of monster that really was an awful, awful thing.
You were talking about inequality being a threat to democracy. How do you see AI as a threat to democracy? I mean, AI hasn't fully been realized yet, but do you think it could increase inequality enough to pose a catastrophic threat to democracy? Or do you think it will just be end up being a very productive tool that we have?
Well, I like what Daron Acemoglu has been writing about this, and that seems to me right. And I would tie it up to what I've said about unions, for instance, so that one of the many things that unions used to do in the private sector was negotiate about working conditions with employers. And the book that Daron and Simon Johnson have written talks about how innovations throughout history, the form in which they were adopted, depended on who had the power at the moment in which they were done. So the upsurge of AI, which if it is for real, I would take as further evidence that it's really important that we get working people around the table and making decisions about how these things happen. There's this quote that we much like about, if you're not at the table, you're almost certainly on the menu. And, that's not what we want to see happen here. Yeah.
Hi. So I study economics, so I don't know that much about ethics, but I was curious if you could, your argument about how we have additional obligations to fellow citizens versus those who are not fellow citizens. And I was just wondering if you could flesh that out a little more, how you came to that, especially in contrast to the more kind of veil of ignorance argument.
It's just that I mean, there's nothing, I gave a talk not unlike this to the World Bank, which was a lot of fun, actually. And one of the people in the audience said, I am a proud cosmopolitan prioritarian. That is what I do. That is my life. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you ignored the ethics for the moment, you have to face the practical constraints. And I said to this guy, you're living here in Washington, D.C. The White House is only 200 yards away. And there could be a red-headed, very difficult occupant there again, who would make life very difficult for cosmopolitan prioritarians sitting down the street. But I think beyond that, there are ethical constraints too, that we are locked in this thing, in this contract, whether we like it or not. We all pay taxes, or some of us pay taxes. We all get benefits. We need roads and things, and that is part of, what you get for being a nation. And you might deny the ethics of it and say, well, the ethics don't really matter to me. I just have to do this because I have to do it. But I think it's better than that. There's a wonderful article by Samuel Huntington talking about a sort of anti-cosmopolitan screed, and talking about it's the sort of beginning of the literature on the people placed from nowhere. And he has this wonderful quote from Walter Scott, from I think The Lay of the Last Minstrel, which says, do not people, it's a sort of paean to nationalism, and just saying, if you trod on the ground where you were born, when you come back from a foreign shore and see this, who can not thrill to this? And most people in the world have some deep connection to the place and the people around which they grew up. That Walter Scott poem is written about a place 2 miles from where I grew up, so it may have a special resonance for me. But nevertheless, I think for many people it's real. And when I was a student at Cambridge, I knew a lot of Americans, and it was during the Vietnam War, and they were under a lot of attack. And one of the things that impressed me most was just how much they cared about their country, and what a hard time they were having over what their country was doing. But it wasn't because they didn't care. And I think we've, as educated elite, we've sort of despised this form of nationalism, and I think that's a mistake.
After growing up as the son of a physician, I became very interested in your work. But right now, I feel an acute concern, and I'd like to hear how you see the situation. Data on the OECD countries and elder care suggests that the United States is paying twice as much per person as the OECD average. Secondly, we are ranked by the WHO about 38th in the world. And we have this ominous horizon of the baby boom aging out. So the ratio of beneficiaries to the tax base is going to put a lot of pressure on the system. Why, when economics talks about free markets, dynamism, innovation, and a rising tide raising all boats, why are we paying twice as much for worse care, and how are we going to fix it?
Well, I could take a libertarian answer to that, which is because we don't have free markets in these things. I mean, the question as to why the healthcare system, it's not just elder care. It's drugs, it's hospital beds, it's doctor salaries, it's everything to do with the healthcare system. It costs twice as much as the OECD average. And a lot of that is just straight rent seeking, and it's the AMA refusing to let foreign doctors practice in the United States, for example. But it's, the device manufacturers. There are 5 healthcare lobbyists in Washington for every member of Congress. Okay? The 5 of them. You get each guy, here's your 5 lobbyists, they go to the bathroom with you and they make sure that you don't get out of there. Anyway.
Just one last thing before we close. I mean, I just want to kind of stress first 3 things. The book is a really good read. For those of you who haven't read it, it's very accessible and open if you're not an economist. And when I read it, I emailed you because I felt that way instantly. Second, it's really a great opportunity, and I'm looking at some of the sociologists in the room and others, to kind of think creatively about what you have done. It comes out as you speak in terms of thinking of the intersections and connections between different disciplines and how to nurture that, not just the disciplinary kind of, traps we get into, but very good conversations that should take place and don't, and ultimately undermine a lot of the kinds of questions we ask. And finally, I just want to commend you. Yes, you retired or left the profession, but there's not a lot of academics or intellectuals who are so self-introspective about what they have done, what their discipline has done, and looking in a pretty tough way at some fundamental mistakes that you have seen among your colleagues and even in your own thinking. And I think it's actually to be commended. It's a model to have a book like this. We need more of that because ultimately that's really how we advance disciplines and thinking. So congratulations.
Thank you. We Scottish Calvinists like to self-flagellate, that's just our...
All right, so I saw some hands that remained up when we closed the event, but not to worry, the conversation can continue in the back room in the Schultz Dining Hall. Angus will be there to sign books. I believe you can also purchase books if you don't have a copy. So the conversation and discussion can continue. And also if you're hungry, there's food and I believe drink. Before we go, just one more thank you to Angus and Julian. Thank you so much for such a great event.